Good morning, everybody. So, out of curiosity, anybody see when you came in, you get the little cross thing? Kendall, our office administrator, drew up a how to make it into a cross thing. So, if you're really bored in the next 35 minutes, I got something for you to do. I cannot do this. This is so beyond my skill set. But if you want, there it is. But I grew up Lutheran, for those who don't know, so this is kind of like Catholic light. So I was very familiar with Palm Sunday thing and the waving it and flailing it and that kind of stuff. But today, I was like, when we were sitting down to plan this service, I was like, oh, how do you talk about the stuff we've been talking about on Palm Sunday? See, if you are new with us or haven't been with us in a while, for the last few weeks, really since Easter or since Christmas, we have been looking at the life of Jesus. And today, the plan is to conclude that service or that series by looking at the death of Jesus. And I guess I should just give this little bit of a disclaimer because I know some people choose to keep their kids in the service. This sermon is probably rated PG-13. I mean, I'm not going to get very graphic, but the truth is it's really difficult to talk about the death and the crucifixion of Jesus without being somewhat graphic in order for us to understand it. So if you have kids and you're like, oh, I don't know that I'm super comfortable with them sitting in this message, you could totally take them down to the basement. I believe the kids are having a PJ day and they're watching a movie downstairs because it's spring break. So if you would feel more comfortable putting your kids there, please, please, please take advantage of that. But this kind of brings up, how do we talk about the death of Jesus on Palm Sunday? And the reason I say this is if you're familiar at all with the events of Palm Sunday is a joyous occasion. It's exciting, right? I mean, Palm Sunday is the day Jesus rides into town and they start cutting down palm branches and waving them all over and they're laying their cloaks on the floor and they're celebrating and they're shouting, yay, yay, yay. And then somehow 5 days later, that joy and that excitement totally pivots. And the shouts of joy and salvation turn to chants for death and crucifixion. And it's hard to kind of make sense of this juxtaposition. And so this morning, before we kind of jump into the events surrounding the death of Jesus, I think it's appropriate for us to kind of back up just a little bit and try to understand what happened. How did we go from Sunday to Friday? How did this pivot occur? Well, as I said, Sunday was a time of great joy and jubilation, and there was a lot of hope and expectancy when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Some people got what he was trying to say, others were kind of oblivious, but everybody was excited about what this man could potentially bring. But all of that seems to change on Monday, because on Monday, for the first time, Jesus begins to take his ministry directly at the religious leadership of Jerusalem at the time. And as we saw, his threats are pretty veiled and implicit, but what he does on Monday is he walks into the temple and he begins flipping over tables. Remember this? Driving out money changers and then calling down curses on the people, calling down curses on the temple. He says that they have perverted God's house of prayer and made it into a den of thieves. These are both quotes of Old Testament passages, as we said, that are intended to be read as curse statements, implicit threats that he intends to rip the authority away from the religious leaders and destroy Jerusalem because of their rejection of him and their rejection of God's intended purpose for the temple. Then on Tuesday, those implicit threats become very explicit. If you remember, Jesus arrives back at the temple on Tuesday of Holy Week and the gloves come off. The religious leaders have had enough of him and they just start demanding, where do you get off doing these things? You know, who gave you the authority to walk in here and start demanding things and calling down curses like a prophet? And then Jesus and their leaders had this back and forth tussle. Remember, we looked at this a couple weeks ago. And ultimately, at the end of this, Jesus begins to be very explicit and say, because of their rejection of him and because of their failures of leadership, they are going to lose everything. All power, all authority, all wealth, all of it's going to be stripped. And the temple of Jerusalem, along with the city of Jerusalem, will eventually be destroyed because they have rejected God's prophet. They have rejected him. And by the end of the events of Tuesday, it becomes very clear, I would want to kill him too if I was a religious leader. I mean, they are just going to town at each other. When we get to Wednesday into early Thursday, we really don't know what happened. The Gospels are quite silent. The best guess is that Jesus and his disciples retreated to the town of Bethany for a couple miles away, and just a little relaxation and space. We don't know exactly what happened. The only thing we do know is that somewhere after Jesus threatens the religious leaders and threatens to destroy Jerusalem, and before the events of Thursday night, Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, has had enough. And he decides it's time to be done with Jesus, and so he actually goes and conspires with the religious leaders to turn Jesus over. When we get to the events of Thursday night, you remember Jesus returns back to Jerusalem and celebrates the Passover with his disciples. And this meal is interesting for a number of different reasons. But as we said, when we looked at this a couple weeks ago, the entire purpose of this meal is Jesus trying to prepare his disciples for what's to come. He's trying to help them make sense of the brutality of Friday. And so he explains through simple elements like bread and wine that this is his body and his blood broken and shed for them. He begins to help them wrap their heads around the fact that soon he's going to be away from them. And what is he going to be doing? He's going to prepare a place for them. And how are they supposed to operate in his absence? Love others as I have loved you. I am the vine, you're the branches. Remain in me. He spends the entire night caring for his disciples, even though he's fully aware of what's about to happen. And then after the meal, we saw Jesus walks from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples. He continues to teach them along the way. And then when they finally get to the garden, he dismisses the bulk of his disciples. He says, all right, boys, you can go to bed. You've had 4 glasses of wine. Remember we looked at that, the Passover meal? They're tired. But he asked 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, hey, come with me. I need you to pray with me. And from the moment Jesus enters into the garden, he allows his thoughts, he allows his focus to begin to shift on what he must now endure. And as we saw last week, Jesus is truly in agony over what is about to befall him. And it's not just the physical things that he must endure in the cross. As we said, there's also a spiritual dimension that weighs incredibly heavy on Jesus. For on the cross, he will take on the full weight of humanity's sin, along with all of its consequences. And so he prays, Father, if there's any way to take this cup, your cup of wrath, away from me, I would like that. But your will be done, not mine. It's powerful. And then as we saw, in the midst of that garden space, even though he has asked his disciples to stand with him, they begin to abandon him. They can't even keep their eyes up. He's bawling his heart out, and they're just passing out, snoozing. Eventually, they're woken up, though, by Judas, arriving with a fairly large armed guard to arrest Jesus. And they hear that Judas is somehow betraying Jesus now with a kiss. And in the confusion, they end up fleeing, leaving Jesus entirely alone as he begins his journey to the cross. And again, as we saw last week, that journey to the cross begins with a sham trial in the middle of the night. Kangaroo court is what it's effectively called. And that's because the verdict has already been predetermined. They were just looking for evidence to justify themselves and their actions. They already decided they were going to kill him. They just needed to figure out how and why. And so they create this system where they bring in all sorts of false witnesses that they can't really get to agree, but eventually they just ask Jesus flat out, are you the Messiah? Are you the guy? And he goes, yeah. I am, but actually I'm more than just the Messiah. I'm the Son of Man, talked about in Daniel 7. And when they hear this, they're so frustrated that the high priest, we're told, rips his cloak and judges him as being a blasphemer, and everybody else agrees Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, and they demand his death. The problem is, as we saw, Rome doesn't care about the charge of blasphemy. Why do they care about a Jewish religious issue, right? But they can't kill Jesus, so they have to manipulate the charges. And so they say, you know what we can do? We can take this idea of Messiah and we can hand him over on charges of sedition, of being a traitor to the state, a threat to Rome. And that's what they do. So they end up taking Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate ends up asking him a bunch of questions. Are you really the king of the Jews? Are you a threat to Rome? And after this long back and forth that you could read about in the Gospel of John, Pilate declares, Jesus is no threat. This man is entirely innocent. And then as we saw, 3 times Pilate tries to weasel out of convicting Jesus. The problem is the crowds are insistent, and they don't let up, and they demand his crucifixion. So eventually Pilate, in an attempt to save his own neck, washes his hands of Jesus and says, "It's on you. It's on Pilate." But he tries to pass the buck again. And then he hands Jesus over to be crucified. Now, part of that process of being crucified was being whipped and being beaten, and Pilate had already done that through the trials. That was one of the ways he tried to weasel out of it. He's like, if I just beat him within an inch of his life, then, maybe they'll let him off the hook. No. So Jesus has already been whipped. He's already been beaten. He's already been mocked. He's already been spit on. And what we see is that from this point on, Jesus is now going to be forced to carry his cross to a hill where he's going to be crucified. The problem is, Jesus has lost so much blood. He's so exhausted by this point that he's incapable of carrying his own cross. This is where I want to pick up the story, and I'm going to read quite a bit this morning out of Mark's gospel. And so just go ahead and listen. We'll have it on the screen as well. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father is Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. And eventually they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And then they offered him a wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. This would have been some sort of very mild sedative, and he passed on it. And then they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified him between two rebels, one on his right, one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple in 3 days and rebuild it, come down from that cross, save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't even save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see, and then sure, we'll believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until about 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with wine vinegar and put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus. And they said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes down and takes him." With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last breath. The curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as the evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who had himself been waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked if Jesus had already died, and when he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So this is the story. I'd love to kind of spend a little bit of time trying to unpack it and make some more sense of it with you this morning. And so let's start with Simon. So again, we said Jesus begins this journey to the cross after having been beaten. All criminals were forced to carry their own cross. The problem is, as we see, Jesus had lost too much blood. He couldn't carry it on his own. Now, it's not clear whether Simon alone carried it or Simon had to assist Jesus in carrying it, but odds are Simon did not volunteer for this assignment. It seems that he was kind of picked out of the crowd and forced to carry the cross with Jesus, an unenviable task to say the least. And yet they walk somehow down to the hill called Golgotha. That's the term in Aramaic, in Jesus' native tongue, for the hill. In Greek, the term is craniotopou. It literally means the hill of the cranium, the skull. In Latin, though, the term is Calvary. And so if you've ever heard the term Calvary, it's just a Latin word for the name of this hill. The one thing we know about this hill, because there is some debate about where it is exactly, the one thing we are sure of, though, is that it would have been near a main road. And that explains why there were so many people who were able to walk by and mock him. This was not done in secret. This was not done in the backwoods. This was done very much prominently and publicly. And that's because fundamentally what you need to understand is that crucifixion was always intended to be understood as the ultimate deterrent. It was always supposed to be a warning sign to future criminals, future slaves, future threats to Rome of this is your future if you cross us. They didn't want to keep this private. And so Jesus gets there, and what we learn is that they affixed him to the cross. Now, we should kind of back up and explain crucifixion in general, and this is where it'll get a little graphic, and I apologize for that, but I think it's important for us to understand. In general, what we see is there's three main ways a person was crucified. One was on a beam, like a cross beam that was in the shape of an X, if you could imagine it. So you have 1 foot down, up, that kind of stuff. The others is either an uppercase T or a lowercase t. Church history, because of the sign that was posted above Jesus' head, has always assumed Jesus was crucified on a lowercase t, like the cross behind me. That's where we get that symbol from. But it wasn't the only version. Typically, when a person was crucified, though, they were not nailed to a cross. In fact, they were most often bound to a cross with rope. And the reason for that is because the cross was solely determined to stretch out the greatest amount of agony and the greatest amount of shame for the greatest amount of time. That was its entire intended purpose. The ultimate deterrent was to show you how we can inflict the most amount of pain, the most amount of shame, for the longest amount of time. And so nailing people through their hands would have just caused wounds, bleeding, and it would have expedited the death process. So it's rare that people were nailed to the cross. But in being nailed and being bound to the cross, as you can imagine, you have no way of protecting yourself from the elements, which you are then exposed to day in and day out. And what you need to understand, and Pilate alludes to this, crucifixion was not quick. It often took multiple days for a person to die after being crucified. And so for multiple days, you lay there unable to swat away the sweat, the bugs, the birds, the wild animals, all of whom would have been drawn to the open wounds that existed on your body. Again, we can get more and more graphic, but we don't need to do this. Again, you can see crucifixion is incredibly cruel. It's actually something that Alexander the Great initiated. His people came up with it, but the Romans perfected it. It's a disgusting, cruel, sick form of punishment, one of the cruelest ever devised. And again, it lasted for days. So again, I could talk about the pain, the agony Jesus must have endured, but I think we also forget the shame that would have been involved in this. Again, just being associated with the cross would have been shameful enough. This was something that was reserved solely for the lowest of low in Roman society. The slaves, the traitors, the threats to Rome, the criminals. This was not a practice that was generally done. And on top of that, you have to now add the shame of, well, they're not given bathroom breaks. Very typically, they're hung naked for everybody to see for days on end. For Jews, it's even more intense because if you remember, and Paul alludes to this in the book of Galatians, for a Jew to hang on a tree means they are accursed by God, condemned by God, cut off from God, damned is the word we would use. And yet this is what Jesus endured. Beginning sometime after 9 a.m., lasting somewhere till about 3 p.m. Now what you need to understand is Jewish timekeeping, and it's not really Jewish, just ancient timekeeping, is not really very accurate. They didn't have watches, they didn't have clocks. The way they would tell time is based on the position of the sun. And so what Mark is trying to tell us is that somewhere when the sun was about a quarter of the way up, 3 or 4 hours into the day, Jesus began to be crucified. But then as the story continued, we realized that from noon, when the sun is directly overhead, until sometime when the sun ended up over here, there was darkness that descended over the land. Now, throughout the years, tons of people have tried to make sense of what this darkness was. Was this a supernatural event? Was this a preternatural event? A physically natural event? A naturally natural event? Or what was happening? And the truth is, we don't know. The best interpretation, I think, actually goes back to the early church fathers who saw this darkness over the land as creation itself groaning over the injustices now heaped upon the author of creation. But it's just an interpretation. What else we know about Jesus' crucifixion really comes from his own lips. If you didn't know, Jesus ends up saying 7 different things the Gospels record while he hangs on the cross. Now, the truth is we don't know the order of these things. We don't know when in the span of time these things would have been laid out. But in general, this is what most people assume was the order of Jesus' 7 statements. The first one comes from Luke's gospel, and it's right after Jesus is hung up on the cross. Right after the cross is put in place and he's left hanging there in the midst of his agony and the pain of that. I mean, if you could just imagine that. He looks down at the Roman soldiers who have just crucified him. He sees the crowds that are mocking him, and he says this, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." He prays. The thing that strikes me in the midst of this one is Jesus is just true to form, even in the end. Right? His entire ministry has been to ignorant, sinful humans who have no idea how stupid they are, how wicked they are. And yet even here, in the face of some of the greatest level of brutality and betrayal and sham mockery trials and cowardice and all the stuff we talked about last week, Father, forgive them. Powerful. Again, sometime later, while he's hanging on the cross, we learn that one of the thieves who originally was mocking Jesus ends up having a change of heart. And Luke tells us that at some point he ends up rebuking the other thief on the cross and just goes, "Look, dude, we deserve this. This guy didn't deserve it. He's innocent." And so he shouts out to Jesus, "Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, remember me." To which Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And in a couple weeks, we're going to start a series looking at heaven and the afterlife and what happens when we die and all that stuff. And we're going to come back to this verse because very clearly it tells us there is something more to come. There's a lot more to the story than just death. But we'll get to that in a few weeks. Again, sometime later, Jesus looks out at the crowd and he sees his mom and he sees some other women and then he sees one of his disciples present. And in compassion, even there hanging on the cross in agony, tries to take care of his own mom. And so he says to her, "Woman, this is your son." And to the disciple, who we assume is John, "John, this is your mother." In other words, I need you to take care of my mom. I need you to bring her in. I need you to provide for her. He's caring about other people. In my opinion, as I look at it, I would imagine this kind of happened first before the thief changing his mind. I think this gives me reason. As you look at the way Jesus is hanging there and the things that Jesus is doing and the things Jesus is saying, and that seems to be what's compelling for the thief, but I'm just guessing. I don't know. As we read, after darkness had been on the land for about 3 hours, Jesus in a loud voice shouts, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, what you may not know is this is actually a prayer out of the book of Psalms. Psalm 22:1 is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's David's shout of prayer. Now, what many scholars have come to conclude is that this is the moment. This is very much near the end of Jesus' time. And this is the moment when he takes on the full weight of humanity's sin. And as a result of taking on humanity's sin, he feels the full abandonment of God. As we talked about last week, God and sin cannot occupy the same space. So why is he feeling the abandonment from God? Odds are this is when he's taken on the full sins of the world. After this, most likely, John records Jesus as saying, "I thirst." Now, this could simply be a literal, "I'm thirsty." He's been hanging out there in the elements for hours on end. It's totally reasonable. But throughout the history of the church, this has always also had a spiritual undertone, tapping into this sense that Jesus has emptied himself of the divine to take on the humanity's sin. And so it could be this longing for God. But again, that's just a guess. After this, though, Jesus says, "It is finished." It's a simple mission accomplished statement. By this point, having taken on the full sins of humanity, after having loved people to the fullest, after having taught them the way to God, after having taught them what it looks like to live as part of the kingdom, Jesus can now sit there at the end of his life and say, "I did it. It's done. Humanity is free." And then as we read, most of the gospel writers have Jesus just shouting out one last thing as he releases his breath. Luke tells us what he shouted out was another prayer, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Another quote out of Psalm 31:5. And I think this makes sense. As Jesus hangs there on the cross, his mind is drawn towards the Psalms. He's trying to filter out how to pray. He's falling on, he doesn't have the words, and so he goes back to his prayer book. That makes sense to me. But the key here is, and all the Gospels make this clear, is that it is Jesus willingly, selflessly giving of his life. Jesus is bowing out with his breath. It wasn't taken from him. He commits it over. From here, as we read, there was a big earthquake. Don't really know what that was about. Don't know how to explain that. We didn't have seismographers. I don't even know if that's the right word. Seismic graphers, you know where it is. We don't know how big the earthquake was, but we know it had an effect on the city. Somehow the curtain between the temple walls, or between the holy place and the holy of holy place, that ripped open. But I think the really incredible thing is we see that the darkness recedes. And then, did you catch it? The professional executioner, who's probably presided over dozens of crucifixions, sees the way this man died and sees the effects of creation in response to his death. And this man cannot help but be moved. This man cannot help but declare, surely this was a righteous man. Surely this was the Son of God. After this, again, as we read, Joseph of Arimathea gets permission from Pilate to take Jesus' body and bury it. Joseph, John tells us, is assisted by Nicodemus, another secret disciple of Jesus who sat on the ruling council. Presumably neither Nicodemus or Joseph voted against Jesus and thought the whole thing was unjust. And so they give him a proper burial. Would have involved cleaning off all the blood, packing the body with spices to prevent the smell of decomposition, wrapping it. And then they left him in a tomb. And that is the end of Jesus' life. But as we know, that's not the end of his story. And it's why next week we will gather in celebration. It's why next week we will rejoice at the fact that after 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Jesus comes back to new life and the game completely changes. Everything is different. The world will never be the same. But hear me on this, before we just rush to that, before we just jump to Sunday, because let's be honest, nobody likes to sit in the discomfort of Friday. Hit pause. Somebody told me this once, and I thought it was incredibly profound, and I think it applies here. They said, you really can't receive forgiveness until you understand why you need it. I can say, I'm sorry, oh, I forgive you, and then move on. And yet that's what we do, right? Like we just move on to Easter, and it's like, great, I don't need to deal with Friday. But in truth, you and I are never going to be able to understand the full power, the full significance, the full weightiness, the full joy of Sunday if we aren't willing to sit in the depravity and the depths of Friday and the implications of what we just read. See, throughout church history, mainly our Catholic brothers and sisters have modeled this really well, looking towards Saturday as a day they call Holy Saturday, a day that is set apart. Between Good Friday and between Easter Sunday, you have Saturday. And the entire intent of Holy Saturday is to try to get inside the head of the disciples and ask, what would life be like if all we had was Friday? What if Friday was truly the end of the story? How does that affect our life? How does that affect the world if Friday is truly it? If there was no Sunday, if Sunday wasn't a given, if Sunday wasn't promised, and this, what we read, is it, if this is where the Gospels ended, how does that change the story? How does that affect the way you think about the death of Jesus? Here's some questions, Holy Saturday reflection questions for you. How different would your life be if Friday was truly the end of the story? How different would your perception of God be if Easter Sunday never happened? How would you feel about your own death or the death of your loved ones if there was no historical resurrection to actually base your hope on? How would you feel about the weightiness of your own sin if all you had was the cross? Just think about it. If the cross is really the end of the story, and if you believe and you know, hey, Jesus went to the cross selflessly, sacrificially, guiltlessly for my sins, end of story, how does that amp up the weightiness of your sin? I'm not going to lie. I think I'm just as guilty of this. I love jumping to Easter Sunday. I would much rather sit there and rejoice and be excited and know I'm forgiven because I don't want to actually sit in the weightiness of what my sins have cost. I don't like it. It's uncomfortable. And yet again, my brothers and sisters, you will never be able to fully appreciate the forgiveness offered to you in Christ and the new life that comes with resurrection until you're able to understand the true consequences and weightiness of your sin that leads to not your death, but the death of Jesus. And so again, I would just ask you to sit back and reflect on these questions. What would life be like if there was no Sunday? You know, it's actually not that hard to do. There's a lot of people, billions of people, who don't believe in the events of Sunday. Many of them also don't believe in the events of Friday. So it's really not that hard to project onto humanity what would it be like to imagine a world without Christmas or without Easter and without Good Friday. I mean, think about this. There's a lot of people out there who don't believe there's a God, or at best would say, like Nietzsche, that God no longer is relevant, that he's walked away, that he's dead, he's useless. But if you play that out, you can still find meaning and significance in your life, 100%. You can in the short term, no doubt. You can find joy in your everyday activities, but that's it. Think about this. If there is no God, if there really is no hope of the future, or at least no hope that you can pin on a historical reality, all you got is wishful thinking. All you got is bet hedging, right? And so you try to be a little better. You try to be good. You try to love well. And you hope, maybe, just maybe, something will come of this. But in the end, there's no real meaning to life. There's no real purpose. There's no ultimate aim. Life just is, and then it isn't. My brothers and sisters, the truth is, if there is no Sunday, we're not all that different from those who believe that. That life just is and then it isn't. Yeah, maybe you've got the hope of the Jews. That maybe one day, hopefully, someday, soon, maybe, okay, there will be a resurrection. But as we're going to see in a couple weeks, even the Jews couldn't agree on that. Fortunately, we do have Easter Sunday. And as we will see next week, it changes everything. But before you rush to it, just consider Friday. One other thing, though. I just want to point this out, that if Friday is all we really had, even if there was no Sunday, I still think the events of Friday should be life-altering. And I don't just make that statement. I don't know if you caught it, but in the story there are 3 men who don't know anything about Sunday, and yet who simply by observing the events of Friday have their life completely, radically turned upside down. Simon the Cyrene, the thief on the cross, and the Roman centurion. Simon the Cyrene is forced to carry Jesus' cross. Now, he doesn't make a profession of faith or anything like that in the story, but did you catch the way Mark introduced him? Simon the Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. What is that detail doing in that story? We don't get anybody else's lineage or their progeny in the story. Why are Rufus and Alexander called out? Well, most likely because the community to whom Mark is originally writing knows Rufus and Alexander. They're a part of the community. How'd they get in? Most likely from their dad's very brief time walking with Jesus. There was something so profound and significant about that walk. It was enough to change Simon's heart, who had no awareness of him. And then you get to the thief on the cross. And again, I think the only logical explanation for the thief's pivot from mocking Jesus to submitting to Jesus can only be understood through his observation of Jesus' character on the cross. He doesn't know theology. It's not like Jesus is handing out lessons up on the cross. All he has is to observe the way this man handled the situation, and that was life-changing for him. And the Roman soldier. Surely this was a righteous man. Surely this was the Son of God. What changed it? Not Easter. Friday. And so I really do believe, my brothers and sisters, again, before we just rush off to Sunday, there is something for us to be transformed by simply in reflecting on the events of Friday. And so this Holy Week, as we look forward to celebrating Easter, I would encourage you to spend some time chewing on these questions. If Friday was the end of the story, how would that shape your thoughts? How would it change your perception of God? How would it change your perception of death? How would it change your perception of sin? If Friday was it, would that be enough? It's a question only you can ask. This week, we're going to continue to help you in that process. We're going to offer a Maundy Thursday service. Jordan mentioned it earlier, 6:30 Thursday night. Now, I'll tell you this, if you've never been to a Maundy Thursday service, it's quite different. It's not like a normal service on a lot of levels. Number one, there's no sermon. Number two, the night will progressively get darker when you're going, duh, John. Yeah, I get it. I know that's how it works. But you'll walk in and the lights will be on, and there'll be candles everywhere, and then as the service progresses, we will get darker and darker by snuffing out candles, darkening lights, so that if you're not in Michigan, you walk out and it's dark at night. Michigan kind of ruins that. But the intent is we get darker. The night will also get more and more somber, it'll get more serious, and it'll get quieter. All we do is we come in, we receive communion, and then we listen to Scripture, and we sing a song of reflection. Scripture, reflection, Scripture, reflection. That's it. It's a sacred night, special night, completely different than any other night. And if you'd like, it's a great space to come. But you don't need to come to that night to reflect. If you want, open up the Gospels and just read the accounts of Jesus' arrest. Mark 15, John 19, Luke 25. It's in there. You can Google it. But just spend some time reflecting. I think these are worthwhile questions, though, in the midst of your reflection. If this is all you had, how does that change things? And then join us Sunday as we celebrate. Join us Sunday as we realize that that is not the end of the story and that God has so much more in store for us. We're going to continue worshiping this morning by practicing more reflection. Kurt's going to come up and lead us in a couple different songs. The first one, very few of you know. It's Stricken, Smitten, and Afflicted. It's a great old hymn, and it was a hymn that I was deeply struck by this week, and so I sent it to Kurt, and I said, hey, can we sing this? And he looked at the lyrics and was like, yeah, this is good. And so if you don't want to sing and you just want to reflect, just look at the lyrics, listen to what they say, and then he'll lead us into the singing of When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And I would invite you to stand, sing, shout your heart out during that one. But let me pray for you as Kurt comes forward. Father, we are grateful for your Son. It's hard to stand in the foot of the cross or in the shadow of the cross, really, and not be grateful, not be humbled, not be overwhelmed. I think the purest expression of love is seen in the man on the cross, who doesn't complain once and yet spends the entire time caring for other people. God, we know it is our sin that held him there. Every single one of us is guilty. And yet in your infinite grace and in your infinite love, we also know it is finished. The story has been rewritten. Lord, I pray as we continue to reflect on the events of Friday, and as we look forward to the events of Easter Sunday, that by your Spirit you would begin to help us more richly, deeply appreciate what you have done for us, the weightiness of our sin, and how through the resurrection you have offered us an entirely new life. Lord, hear our prayers. In Jesus' name, amen.